Ambassador Zekthara pressed his scaled fingers against the control panel of his research ship and watched the third planet of the Sol system grow larger on his viewing screen. The crimson tide moved silently through space toward the world these primitive beings called Earth. His purple eyes gleamed with anticipation as he prepared to study what his superiors considered the most backward species in this sector of the galaxy. The Valderon Empire had sent him here to decide if humans deserved a place among the civilized races of the galaxy. Zekthara had studied dozens of primitive worlds before, and the answer was always the same. These young species destroyed themselves long before they could reach the stars in any meaningful way. He expected nothing different from the creatures living on this small blue world. His ship's sensors began feeding him data about the planet below, and Zekthara felt his familiar smugness return. The atmospheric readings showed toxic levels of industrial waste floating in the air. The oceans registered as acidic death zones where nothing could live. Vast areas of the continents appeared as brown scars where forests should have been green. Cities huddled under protective domes like frightened animals hiding from predators. Zekthara clicked his tongue in the way his people showed disgust. These humans had done exactly what every failed species did. They had poisoned their own home in pursuit of short-term gains, and now they were dying slowly in the mess they had created. He began composing his report in his mind. Another dead-end species that would be extinct within a few centuries. The ambassador pulled up comparison data from other worlds he had studied. The pattern was always identical. First, the primitive species discovered fire and tools. Then they learned to dig metals from their planet's crust. They built cities and machines without understanding the consequences. Finally, they covered their world in poison and watched their civilization collapse as their environment died. Around them, humans appeared to be in the final stage of this cycle. His sensors showed that their planet was barely able to support life anymore. Most of their surface was too contaminated for normal habitation. Their cities existed inside artificial barriers that protected them from the toxic air they had created. It was pathetic but predictable. Zekthara opened a communication channel to his home world and began recording his preliminary findings. He spoke in the formal tone required for official reports. The humans of Earth had followed the standard pattern of self-destruction seen in 97% of primitive civilizations. Their planet showed clear signs of industrial poisoning, ecological collapse, and atmospheric contamination. Based on current trends, they would achieve complete extinction within 2 to 3 centuries. He recommended immediate classification as a failed species, with no potential for galactic membership. There was no point in wasting resources on a race that could not even keep their own planet alive. The Valdoran Empire had better things to do than nursemaid dying civilizations. Zekthara prepared to end his transmission and depart for his next assignment. His ship's artificial intelligence interrupted him. The computer suggested conducting a more detailed surface scan before filing the final report. Proper scientific method required at least 1 week of close observation to confirm initial assessments. The ambassador felt annoyed at the delay, but knew his superiors valued thorough documentation. If he returned with incomplete data, they might question his competence. He had worked too hard to reach his current position to risk it over a few extra days spent watching primitives stumble toward their doom. Zekthara adjusted his ship's course to bring it into Earth's upper atmosphere. The Crimson Tide's cloaking systems would keep it hidden from human detection equipment. He could observe their final struggles without them ever knowing a superior being was documenting their failure. The viewing screen now showed the planet's surface in sharp detail. Zekthara could see the dome-covered cities scattered across the poisoned continents. Between them stretched empty wastelands where nothing grew. The oceans looked like pools of industrial waste under a sky choked with brown clouds. It was exactly what he expected to find. He settled into his observation chair and began setting up recording equipment. This would be an easy week of work followed by a simple report. The humans had destroyed their world through the same stupidity and greed that doomed every primitive species. They were probably fighting wars over the remaining clean resources while their planet died. Beneath them, Zekthara felt a familiar satisfaction as he began his detailed observations. In a few days he would file his report and move on to the next assignment. The Valdoran Empire would mark Earth as another failed world and forget these humans ever existed. It was a natural order of things. Only species wise enough to preserve their home planets deserved to join the galaxy's advanced civilizations. The ambassador began his first detailed scan of human settlements, expecting to document the desperate final years of another doomed race. He had no idea that everything he thought he knew about humans and their dying planet was about to change completely. Zektharos spent his first day of detailed observation confirming what he already knew about dying civilizations. The humans lived in their protected cities while their planet rotted around them. Their air was poison and their water was acid. Any reasonable species would have abandoned this world long ago and fled to the stars. Instead, these stubborn creatures clung to their ruined home like parasites, refusing to leave a dead host. On the second day, something caught his attention that did not fit the usual pattern. In what his star charts called the Amazon region, thousands of humans were working outside their protective domes. They wore environmental suits, but they were not fleeing or hiding. Instead, they were building something enormous in the poisoned wasteland. Dr. Alina Rodriguez stood at the center of the construction site, directing teams of workers who moved with surprising efficiency. They were assembling massive towers that stretched high into the toxic atmosphere. Zekthara watched through his sensors as these structures began operating, somehow pulling the poisoned air through complex filtration systems. The Valderon ambassador felt confused by what he was seeing. These towers seemed designed to clean the atmosphere, but that made no sense. When a planet reached this level of contamination, the damage was permanent. Every advanced species in the galaxy knew this basic fact. The humans were wasting valuable resources on an impossible task. Zekthara focused his sensors on other regions and found similar projects everywhere. In the dead oceans, floating platforms covered the water's surface. Human teams, led by Captain Jake Morrison, worked around the clock on these stations, dumping strange substances into the acidic water. The ambassador's instruments detected modified algae and engineered coral being released into the Dead Seas. This was even more puzzling than the atmospheric towers. Dead oceans stayed dead. The chemical balance was too far gone to restore. These humans were throwing away resources and manpower on projects that could never succeed. It confirmed his opinion that they were a failed species, but their behavior was stranger than usual. Most dying civilizations spent their final years fighting wars over remaining resources or building escape ships to flee their poisoned worlds. The humans were doing neither. Instead, they were throwing everything they had at restoration projects that violated basic scientific principles. Zekthara decided to investigate their underground cities to see if the real evacuation efforts were happening there. His deep scanning sensors penetrated the earth and revealed something that made his purple eyes widen in shock. The underground networks were not refugee camps or emergency shelters. They were vast manufacturing complexes producing advanced technology. Billions of humans lived in these subterranean cities, but they were not hiding from their dying surface world. The underground facilities were connected by high-speed transport systems that moved people and equipment to the surface constantly. The humans were using their underground cities as bases for their impossible restoration projects. Even more confusing, Zekthara detected space elevators and orbital platforms that should have been escape routes for the wealthy elite. Instead, these space installations were manufacturing specialized equipment and shipping it back down to Earth. The pattern was completely backwards from every other dying civilization he had studied. Normal primitive species used their space technology to flee their ruined worlds. They built colony ships and evacuation platforms to carry survivors away from the poison they had created. The humans were doing the opposite. They were using their space capabilities to bring more resources back to their contaminated planet. Spent the third day trying to understand human logic. Perhaps they were too primitive to realize their restoration efforts were doomed to fail. Maybe their science was so backward they actually believed poisoned air could be cleaned and dead oceans could live again. It was the only explanation that made sense to the Valderon observer. He watched Dr. Rodriguez's teams complete another atmospheric processing tower and begin testing its systems. The massive structure hummed with power as it sucked in toxic air and expelled something cleaner. Zekthara's instruments confirmed that the air around the tower was gradually becoming less poisonous, but he dismissed this as a temporary local effect. In the oceans, Captain Morrison's floating platforms were showing similar impossible results. The water around their installations was slowly becoming less acidic. New marine life forms were actually growing in areas that had been completely dead just weeks earlier. Zekthara checked his instruments several times, certain there must be some error in the readings. The ambassador pulled up scientific data from the Valderon archives to confirm what he already knew. Atmospheric poisoning beyond a certain threshold was irreversible. Ocean acidification past critical levels was permanent. Soil contamination at the levels he detected on Earth could never be cleaned. The humans were achieving results that contradicted established scientific fact. Zekthara began to feel the first stirrings of doubt about his assessment. Either his instruments were malfunctioning, or the humans possessed restoration technology far beyond what any primitive species should be able to develop. Both possibilities were deeply troubling for different reasons. He decided to extend his observation period by another month. His superiors would expect a thorough investigation if he was going to report findings that contradicted standard scientific knowledge. The humans were still clearly a failed species living on a dying world, but their methods of dealing with failure were unlike anything in the galactic databases. As night fell over the Amazon restoration site, Zekthara watched Dr. Rodriguez's teams continue working under artificial lights. They showed no signs of the desperation or panic he expected from a doomed civilization. Instead, they worked with the methodical patience of people who believed completely in what they were doing. The Valdoran ambassador settled in for a much longer observation period than he had originally planned. These humans were still primitives, destroying their own planet, but they were the strangest primitives he had ever encountered. Something about their behavior suggested there was more to their story than he had initially understood. 3 weeks into his extended observation period, Zekthara discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about human civilization. While monitoring communication signals from the underground cities, he intercepted a briefing that made his scaled skin crawl with disbelief. Environmental engineer Lisa Chen stood before a massive holographic display showing the entire planet, Earth. She was addressing hundreds of other humans gathered in what appeared to be a central command facility deep underground. The display showed colored regions across every continent, each marked with progress indicators and timeline projections. Chen began explaining something called Project Genesis, and Zekthara listened with growing amazement. This was not a desperate, last attempt to save small portions of their dying world. The humans were conducting a complete planetary restoration that covered every square kilometer of Earth's surface. The scope was so vast that it defied comprehension. The holographic display showed atmospheric processes being deployed across all 7 continents. Chen explained that these machines were designed to gradually return Earth's air to what she called pre-industrial composition over the next 200 years. Zekthara realized that the towers he had been observing were just a tiny fraction of a global network. Dr. Ryan Murphy took over the briefing and began discussing geological engineering projects that made the Valdoran ambassador question his own sanity. Human teams were using controlled nuclear explosions to redirect underground rivers toward former desert regions. They were literally reshaping their planet's water systems to restore areas that had been dry wastelands for thousands of years. The humans were not just trying to undo the damage they had caused during their industrial period. They were attempting to improve their entire planet beyond its original natural state. Murphy showed projections of new forest systems that would be more diverse and resilient than anything that had existed in Earth's history. Zekthara watched biotechnician Dr. Amanda Foster present her work on genetic reconstruction projects. In laboratories hidden beneath the Earth's surface, human scientists were rebuilding extinct species from preserved DNA samples. They had somehow maintained genetic libraries of every life form that had ever lived on their planet. The alien observer felt his worldview cracking as he realized the implications. The humans had not accidentally destroyed their environment through ignorance and greed. They had systematically documented every change they made to their planet while developing the technology needed to reverse those changes completely. Professor Ben Taylor stepped forward to discuss the historical archives that supported the restoration project. Zekthara learned that humans had been recording detailed environmental data throughout their entire industrial period. They had tracked the chemical composition of every polluted river, the genetic patterns of every extinct ecosystem, and the migration routes of every lost species. The scope of human record-keeping was staggering. They had deliberately maintained perfect documentation of their planet's original state while simultaneously destroying it. This suggested a level of long-term planning that challenged everything Zekthara believed about primitive civilizations. Returned to the holographic display and began showing progress reports from restoration sites around the globe. The atmospheric processes were ahead of schedule in cleaning the air. Ocean restoration platforms were exceeding projections for marine ecosystem recovery. Soil remediation projects were converting toxic wastelands into fertile ground faster than originally planned. Zekthara realized that what he had interpreted as the death throes of a failed civilization was actually the middle phase of the most ambitious environmental project ever attempted. The humans had not destroyed their world through stupidity. They had deliberately damaged it while simultaneously developing the tools needed to rebuild it completely. The briefing continued with Dr. Foster explaining how genetic reconstruction was being combined with ecosystem engineering to create hybrid environments that mixed the best characteristics of different historical periods. The restored Earth would not just match its original biological diversity, it would exceed anything that had existed naturally. Murphy presented data showing how restoration techniques developed on Earth were being simultaneously tested on 17 other worlds that humans had identified for future colonization. Their home planet was serving as a prototype for terraforming technology that would allow them to create garden worlds throughout the galaxy. Zekthera felt a chill run through his reptilian body as he began to understand the true scope of human capability. They had not just planned to restore their planet, they had designed their restoration systems to serve as templates for transforming any world they encountered into something better than they found it. The briefing ended with Chen announcing that several continental restoration zones would be ready for full ecosystem deployment within the next 5 years. Millions of reconstructed species would be released into environments specifically designed to support them. The first phase of Project Genesis was approaching completion, ahead of schedule. As the humans dispersed from their command center, Zekthara sat in his observation chair trying to process what he had learned. The species he had dismissed as failed primitives were conducting an environmental engineering project that surpassed anything in Valderon's scientific archives. They were not just surviving on their damaged world, they were using it as a testing ground for technology that could transform the galaxy. The ambassador realized he needed to completely re-evaluate his understanding of human civilization. These were not desperate survivors clinging to a dying planet. They were master engineers who had deliberately scarred their world to perfect the art of planetary restoration. The question was no longer whether humans deserved galactic membership. The question was whether the galaxy was ready for what humans might do to it. Zekthera began composing new observation reports as he watched human teams continue their impossible work across the planet's surface. Everything he thought he knew about this species had been wrong from the beginning. Zekthera spent the next week accessing human historical databases to understand how this impossible restoration project had begun. What he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about primitive species and their relationship with their home worlds. The truth was far more disturbing than simple environmental destruction followed by restoration attempts. Dr. Rachel Morgan was teaching a class of young humans in one of the underground education centers when Zek began monitoring their history lessons. She stood before a timeline display that showed human development over the past 3 centuries and began explaining something that chilled the Valdoran observer to his core. Morgan told her students that their ancestors had not stumbled into environmental destruction through ignorance or accident. Instead, human leaders from the early 21st century had deliberately chosen to accelerate industrial development and ecological damage, as part of a calculated long-term strategy that spanned multiple generations. The human instructor showed climate models developed by their scientists 300 years earlier. These projections demonstrated that Earth would face ecological collapse within 2 centuries. Regardless of any conservation efforts they might attempt, the planet's population was too large and their resource consumption too great to avoid. Environmental disaster through gradual change, faced with inevitable ecological collapse. Human leaders had made a decision that shocked Zekthara with its cold brutality. Rather than trying to slow their planet's destruction, they chose to accelerate it while simultaneously developing advanced restoration technologies. They decided to deliberately push their ecosystem to complete breakdown so they could rebuild it using principles of environmental engineering that were impossible to implement gradually. Morgan explained how this strategy required multiple generations of humans to sacrifice their health, comfort, and natural environment for the benefit of future populations they would never live to see. The humans who initiated Project Genesis knew they were condemning their children and grandchildren to live in the toxic wasteland they were creating. Zekthera watched the young humans in Morgan's class absorb this information without apparent shock or outrage. They had been raised knowing that their ancestors had poisoned their world on purpose as part of a plan to make it better. The casual acceptance of this multi-generational sacrifice disturbed the alien observer more than the environmental destruction itself. Commander Alex Parker appeared on the lesson display to explain the technical aspects of the human strategy. He showed how every restoration technology being used in Project Genesis had been developed during the period of deliberate environmental destruction. Humans had used their own planet as a testing ground for terraforming techniques while actively making it uninhabitable, Parker demonstrated. how atmospheric processes designed to clean Earth's air were based on systems originally created to handle the toxic emissions from accelerated industrial production. Ocean restoration platforms use technology developed to process the acidic waste being deliberately dumped into the seas. Every solution had been designed while the problem was being intentionally created. The commander explained that this approach had allowed humans to develop terraforming technology using real-world conditions rather than theoretical models. They had subjected their planet to every possible form of environmental damage and then perfected methods to reverse that damage completely. The knowledge gained from this process was now being applied to transform other worlds. Zekthara realized that humanity's approach to planetary management represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization. Most species develop terraforming technology through computer simulations and small-scale experiments. Humans had used their entire homeworld as a laboratory, willing to poison it completely to perfect their restoration methods. Dr. Amanda Foster joined the lesson to discuss biological engineering aspects of the project. She explained how human scientists had deliberately caused mass extinctions during their industrial period, while simultaneously preserving genetic samples of every lost species. They had destroyed their planet's biodiversity with one hand while saving it for future reconstruction with the other. Foster showed the students genetic libraries containing the complete biological history of Earth. Every plant, animal, and microorganism that had ever lived on their planet was preserved in molecular detail. The humans had not just documented their world's ecology as they destroyed it, they had captured it perfectly for eventual recreation in improved form. The lesson continued with Morgan explaining how restoration technology developed for Earth was being simultaneously deployed on other worlds throughout human space. Terraforming specialist Maya Williams appeared via communication link from Mars to show how atmospheric processes originally designed for Earth were now converting the Martian atmosphere to support human life. Williams demonstrated how techniques perfected during Earth's restoration were being used to transform dozens of previously uninhabitable worlds into garden planets. The humans were not just rebuilding their homeworld, they were using the knowledge gained from its destruction and restoration to create an empire of engineered worlds throughout their region of space. Zekthara felt a growing sense of unease as he understood the full implications of human planetary engineering capabilities. They had deliberately wounded their own world to master the art of creating perfect ones. This suggested a capacity for long-term thinking and calculated sacrifice that was both impressive and terrifying. The class ended with Morgan showing her students projections of Earth's future state after complete restoration. The planet would not just return to its original condition, it would become a biological paradise that combined the best characteristics of every ecosystem that had ever existed on their world. The humans planned to make their home planet more beautiful and diverse than it had ever been naturally. As the young humans filed out of the classroom, Zekthara realized that humanity represented something far more dangerous than a failed primitive species. They were master planetary engineers who viewed environmental destruction and restoration as tools to be used in service of larger goals. Their willingness to sacrifice their own world for eventual improvement demonstrated a level of species-wide discipline that challenged everything he believed about galactic civilization. The Vald ambassador began to understand that his initial assessment had been catastrophically wrong. Humans were not a dying species clinging to a poisoned world. They were the most sophisticated environmental engineers in known space, and they were just getting started. As Zekthara delved deeper into human historical records, he uncovered documentation that revealed the most disturbing aspects of their planetary restoration project. The sheer ruthlessness with which humans had pursued their long-term goals made the Valderon ambassador question whether any species in the galaxy truly understood what humanity was capable of achieving. Dr. Kevin Stone stood in the Central Archives deep beneath the former site of London, surrounded by holographic displays, showing 3 centuries of human environmental data. He was documenting the sacrifices made by previous generations to ensure Project Genesis would succeed, and his casual tone while discussing acts of deliberate self-harm chilled Zekthara to his core. Stone explained how humans in the 21st century had willingly shortened their own lifespans by decades to accelerate industrial pollution while building restoration infrastructure. They had chosen to live in increasingly toxic environments rather than slowing production of the technologies needed for eventual planetary healing. Entire generations had accepted cancer, respiratory disease, and genetic damage as acceptable costs for their long-term plan. The human historian showed records of how coastal populations had deliberately remained in rising sea level zones to maintain industrial facilities that would have been relocated by any rational species. Millions of humans had died from preventable environmental causes because moving to safety would have delayed restoration technology development by decades. Zekthara watched documentation of how human governments had engineered multiple ecological crises simultaneously to create the worst possible environmental conditions for testing their restoration systems. They had not simply allowed natural disasters to occur. They had deliberately triggered climate shifts, ocean acidification, and atmospheric poisoning to create laboratory conditions on a planetary scale. The alien observer discovered that humans had modified their own biology during this period to survive in the toxic environment they were creating. Dr. Nicole Grant appeared in the historical records explaining how human scientists had edited their own genes to process industrial pollutants, resist radiation, and survive in atmospheric conditions that would kill most galactic species. Grant showed genetic modification records proving that current generation humans were fundamentally different from their ancestors. They had literally evolved themselves to live in poison while developing the tools to remove that poison from their world. The humans had not just sacrificed their environment for future generations, they had sacrificed their original biological form. The documentation revealed that human children born during the worst environmental periods had been deliberately exposed to toxins to test biological adaptation limits. Parents had knowingly raised their offspring in conditions that would cause permanent health damage to gather data needed for genetic modification programs. Zekthara realized that humanity's approach to species survival violated every principle of galactic civilization. Most intelligent races protected their young and preserved their genetic heritage. Humans had systematically damaged both to achieve their restoration goals. They had treated their own children as experimental subjects in a planetary engineering project. Captain Tony Brooks appeared in the archives to discuss marine restoration projects that exceeded all original projections. His teams had converted ocean dead zones into super productive marine nurseries in just decades, rather than the centuries originally planned. The human restoration systems were not just healing their planet, they were improving it beyond anything that had existed in its natural history, Brooks explained. How restoration technology had been deliberately over-engineered during the development phase to ensure it would exceed original ecosystem productivity. The humans had not planned to simply restore their planet to its former state. They had designed their systems to create a biological paradise that surpassed anything their world had naturally achieved. Dr. Melissa Clark joined the discussion to reveal the most disturbing aspect of the human project. Earth's restoration was merely the prototype for a much larger plan that involved terraforming hundreds of worlds. Using techniques perfected during their planetary healing process, the humans were simultaneously creating an empire of engineered worlds while rebuilding their home planet. Clark showed Zekthara classified data about human expansion into nearby star systems. They were not exploring space to find new homes because their planet was dying. They were conquering space because their restoration technology had made them the most powerful terraforming force in their region of the galaxy. The human expansion plans included detailed designs for converting every type of planetary environment into optimal conditions for human habitation. They had developed techniques to transform gas giants, ice worlds, desert planets, and even asteroid fields into garden paradises, using technology originally created to heal Earth. Zekthara learned that human colonial fleets carried restoration equipment capable of completely terraforming a lifeless world within a single generation. The same systems being used to rebuild Earth could transform any planet they encountered into something more beautiful and productive than most naturally habitable worlds. Clark revealed that humans had already begun terraforming operations on 47 different worlds throughout their expanding territory. Each planet was being transformed using techniques perfected during Earth's restoration, but adapted to create unique ecosystems that exceeded anything found in nature. The documentation showed that human terraforming technology was advancing faster than their original projections. They were creating garden worlds more efficiently than any species in galactic history, using methods that treated planetary engineering as casually as other races practiced agriculture. As Zekthara reviewed the final archived reports, he realized that humanity had achieved something unprecedented in galactic civilization. They had deliberately scarred their own world to master the art of creating perfect ones, and now they were using that knowledge to reshape every planet they encountered. The alien ambassador understood that his species and every other member of galactic civilization had completely misjudged what humans represented. They were not a failed primitive race clinging to a dying world. They were master planetary engineers whose capabilities threatened to upset the balance of power. Throughout known space. Looking at the scope of human achievements and their expanding territorial claims, Zekthara realized that humanity posed a greater potential threat to galactic stability than any military conquest. They had the ability to transform any world into something better than what they found, which made them irresistible. Two populations suffering under normal planetary limitations. 2 months after beginning his observation mission, Zekthara witnessed something that forever changed his understanding of what humanity represented in the galactic community. The first continental restoration zone of Project Genesis was about to come online, and millions of humans gathered to watch their planet take its next step toward becoming something greater than it had ever been naturally. Dr. Holly Martinez stood at the center of the ceremonial platform, overlooking what had once been the most polluted region of North America. The toxic wasteland that had existed here for over a century was now a biological paradise that exceeded anything in Earth's natural history. Advanced ecosystems blended characteristics from every climate zone that had ever existed on the planet. Martinez began the activation ceremony by explaining how this restored continental zone represented more than environmental healing. The humans had not simply repaired damage from their industrial period. They had created hybrid ecosystems that combined the best features of tropical rainforests, temperate woodlands, grassland prairies, and Arctic tundra into integrated biological communities that exceeded the productivity of any natural environment. Zekthara watched through his sensors as millions of reconstructed species were released into their new habitats simultaneously. The genetic libraries maintained during Earth's industrial period had been used to create enhanced versions of extinct organisms. These reconstructed life forms were designed to thrive in the engineered ecosystems while maintaining the essential characteristics that made them recognizable as Earth species. The alien observer saw human children playing in forests more lush and diverse than any that had existed in their planet's natural history. These young humans took for granted biological abundance that surpassed the most fertile worlds in Valderon space. They had been born into a paradise created by previous generations who had sacrificed everything to make this moment possible. Craig Thompson approached the ceremonial platform to address the assembled humans about their restoration technologies' broader applications. He explained how techniques perfected during Earth's healing process could now terraform lifeless worlds into garden paradises within a single generation. The knowledge purchased with temporary sacrifice of their home planet had made humanity the most formidable terraforming force in the galaxy. Thompson revealed that human colonial expeditions were already transforming dozens of previously uninhabitable worlds using Earth restoration technology. Each planet was being converted into a unique biological paradise that exceeded natural ecosystem productivity. The humans were creating an empire of engineered worlds that redefined what planetary habitability meant. Zekthara realized that humanity's restoration project represented something far more significant than environmental recovery. They had developed planetary engineering capabilities that allowed them to improve any world they encountered. Their mastery of ecological design had made them potentially the most dangerous species in galactic space. That the ceremony continued with Martinez announcing that $17 additional continental zones would come online over the next 5 years. Earth's complete restoration was proceeding ahead of schedule, and the planet would soon become the most biologically productive world in known space. The humans had not just healed their home, they had transformed it into something unprecedented. That as the celebration concluded, Zekthara began composing his final report to the Valderon Empire. Everything he had initially believed about humanity had been proven catastrophically wrong. They were not a failed species destroying their planet through ignorance. They were master environmental engineers who had deliberately wounded their world to perfect the art of creating ideal ones. The alien ambassador faced a terrible decision as he prepared his recommendations. He could suggest immediate galactic membership for humanity, knowing they would likely begin reshaping every world they encountered. Their terraforming capabilities would make them invaluable allies, but potentially overwhelming competitors for any species that could not match their planetary engineering skills. Alternatively, he could recommend immediate military action against humanity before they became too powerful to contain. Their ability to transform any planet into a paradise would make them irresistible to populations throughout the galaxy. Other species might abandon their home worlds to join human colonies that offered superior living conditions. Zekthera studied the restored Earth below his observation ship and tried to imagine what the galaxy would look like if humanity continued expanding their terraforming operations. They could potentially transform every inhabited world into something better than what existed naturally. The political implications were staggering. The Valderon observer realized that humanity's greatest strength was also their greatest threat to galactic stability. They viewed every planet, including their own, as raw material for something better. Their restoration technology made them capable of improvements that would be impossible for any other species to match or resist. Looking down at Earth's transformed surface, Zekthera understood that humanity represented a fundamental challenge to the existing galactic order. They had achieved technological capabilities that could reshape civilization throughout known space. The question was whether other species would welcome or fear what humans might do to their worlds. The alien ambassador began dictating his final report, knowing that his recommendations would determine not just humanity's fate but possibly the future balance of power in galactic civilization. The humans had proven they could heal and improve damaged worlds, but they had also demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice anything in pursuit of their long-term goals. Zekthara concluded that humanity was simultaneously the most promising and most dangerous species he had ever encountered. Their planetary engineering mastery made them invaluable potential allies, but their ruthless pursuit of improvement made them existential threats to any civilization that could not match their capabilities. That as he prepared to transmit his report to the Valderan Empire, the alien observer took one final look at the restored Earth. The planet was now more beautiful than it had ever been in its natural state, transformed by a species that treated planetary engineering as casually as others practiced agriculture. Whether this represented salvation or doom for galactic civilization remained to be seen.